With a massive character roster approaching 90, there's only so many options that Genshin can make without power creeping old characters. Or is there? Ever since the beginning of time, Genshin has tried their best to, instead of making better units, to make different units. And the inevitable conclusion of this is that niche characters will eventually emerge. Characters such as Faruzan, Shenhe, Gorou, Mika, and some others are all the result of this design philosophy. And with the current rerun of Faruzan, I want to talk about whether this is a problem, what it means for the future of Genshin Impact, and while we're at it, give you a little updated build guide for some of these characters. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. First of all, I think it's always prudent to take a little trip down memory lane and talk about where this problem started so we can find out where it's going. Kujo Sara was their first experiment, and she was a 1-2 punch with Raiden, and then together these make sort of a perfect dolphin bait or whale bait duo, where Raiden's C2 and C3 provide massive ups to your damage, while Kujo Sara C6 also ups Raiden's front-loaded damage, and especially at the time, they were a very, very potent duo. The problem lies with Kujo Sara needing her C6 to really feel like a strong buffer, and at least to me, another problem with Kujo Sara lies in that she's just not strong enough. Like, her overall buffing potential is outclassed by some other more general buffers, which I think is definitely a problem when a niche character isn't even stronger than the general characters. Speaking of generals, General Gorou was their next attempt, and I think that they hit the mark a little bit better with Gorou in that he's a better character at C0 and provides a more worthwhile buff, and even though he still has a very strong C6. In addition to that, there aren't nearly as many alternatives for Itto in terms of buffing because he's much more specialized as a DPS, so they work more in tandem, whereas Raiden can get buffed by anyone. Itto scaling off of defense and not having nearly as many defense buffers has to rely on Gorou a lot more, making him sort of a better character than Kujo Sara in general. Inazuma really was the region of niche buffers though, because Yunjin and Shenhe came next, and both of them, in my opinion, are niche buffers. Yunjin, however, is niche in the sense that she buffs all characters' normal attacks instead of buffing just one element. Like, Kujo Sara is an elemental buffer, same with Gorou, whereas Yunjin buffs everyone's normal attacks. At the time of release, this was basically only Yoimiya, and she sort of works with Ayato and then sort of works with Wanderer, but she's not really the best in slot for any of these characters anymore. I think Yoimiya is the closest thing to best in slot with Yunjin, but Yoimiya is generally considered one of the weaker 5-star carries. So as a result, I think Yunjin is definitely one of the worst, and I know it's sort of a hot take, at least among a lot of the community, that people really like Yunjin and they think she's strong, and I just don't think she's strong. I have a very well built Yunjin. We can check her out. I mean, maybe she's not very well built, but she is level 90 out of 90. I use her on R5 Favonius with 44% crit rate, which is a lot considering I'm not using any crit circlet. I'm using defense circlet, defense goblet, defense sands, and so she's on 4-piece husk, and I'm able to squeak 44.7 crit rate and 210 energy recharge, and she's talent level equivalent to level 8. So yeah, I could take this up one more. I probably will eventually when I get around to it, but I did level 9 to her, and overall, like, she's pretty well built, and I would just rather use double Hydra with Yoimiya, or just use Bennett Zhongli, or use Chiori Zhongli, or just use Vivi Vape, or use Farina something, Farina Yalan Baiju. There's a bunch of options that I would choose sooner than I would choose Yunjin. It's not because I don't like Yunjin. I was really happy to get C6 and really excited to use her. It's just that overall, she's just not that great in my opinion. Her buffing isn't impactful enough, and attack speed has its own problems. That it works good for those characters I mentioned, but for other characters like Eula or other Claymore characters that have hit lag, attack speed only buffs the speed of the attack, not the hit lag, and a lot of characters have a lot of hit lag, so attack speed isn't as good for them. It's just not a very good stat in general, even for characters that should be able to benefit it, like Yoimiya. It needs to be a lot faster than it is, and it's just not. So I hope Yunjin sees more success in the future, and I liked what they were cooking. They just undertuned. And I think this was a problem. This is a general problem with Genshin, is that they'll often just undertune characters for whatever. I guess they just really don't want power creep. They want to keep the value of old units, it seems to me. And so they're willing to risk undertuning units like Yunjin or like Kujo-Sara or even like Gorou. I do think Gorou is strong. I don't think he's undertuned. But with where Ito is in power level, you know, I don't think it would have hurt for him to be stronger either. So I think so far, like if we look at the trend so far, the main problem is that the buffing is not compensating for the nicheness of the character. If you're gonna have a character be this niche and only work in these few team archetypes, they have to be strong enough to compensate, to be better than the general buffers and the general off-field DPSs, which as we know in Genshin are very strong, such as Bennett, Xingqiu, Yelan, Xiangling. When you're a buffer, you're competing with these off-field DPSs and other buffers, and with the strength of those characters, it's rough. And Shenhe is definitely a recipient of this problem. I think Shenhe was pretty strong when she was released, especially as Ayaka was one of the better DPSs, but with Freeze getting worse and worse, and with Farina coming out, and generally just being a really insane buffer, Shenhe has seen less and less use. She's so niche that she's not even a cryo buffer anymore. She's basically just an Ayaka buffer. You don't use her with Ganyu. You don't use her with the only cryo 5-star DPS we've had since in Wriothesley. You don't use them too. It's not that you can't. It's not that it's unusable, but you'd rather run Wriothesley with Farina or with just Bennett and Melt, or with different, like Bennett, Xiangling, something is generally how Wriothesley is played. Even with Ayaka these days, my best clears are not with Shenhe team. I'm saving the team that I'm actually using with Ayaka, my secret Ayaka team. I think it's going to be my next video, so get ready for that. It's not just a secret Ayaka team, it's just anyways, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. But suffice to say is that there's still an argument to be made that Shenhe is the best character for Ayaka, but with where Ayaka is in the meta, which is still good but hard to use, like don't get me wrong, I don't think Ayaka is a bad character. Her raw damage and her multipliers are really, really good. But again, the nicheness of Shenhe to only be a buffer for Ayaka, and for the casual average player, not even provide the best clears, and to not even work with most of the cryo DPSs in the game, I think really goes to show that she is undertuned for how niche she is. I don't think she's awful. She's one of my favorite design characters, and I try to use her whenever I can. And to be honest, it makes me really sad that she doesn't work with the new crowd DPSs, and I don't end up using her for most of my clears these days. I wish it was different. I love Shenhe. She's probably my favorite design character in the game, but it's just the sad state of affairs right now. And so this was Genshin's first attempt at making a 5-star support. And for whatever reason, it seems like they didn't like how it turned out for Shenhe to be a 5-star support for Ayaka. They tried to like rerun them at the same time in a future banner, and I guess for whatever reason they weren't happy with the results because they haven't tried to do another 5-star niche buffer since. And I don't know if that's good or not, to be honest. Like, I don't know if I prefer the niche buffers to be 4 stars that only activate fully from their C6, or if I prefer them to be full-on 5-star characters. Because on one hand, you know, it's nice to pull for if you're like really into Raiden, for example, and you want Kujo-Sara, and she has another niche support nowadays, but it's nice to be able to pull and get cons for your favorite character, and so you're kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak. Like with Ito, if you pull for C6 Gorou, yeah, you can't guarantee your C6 Gorou, but you may get C1 or C2 Ito. Same with Raiden and Kujo-Sara, and same with Faruzan and Wanderer, or Faruzan and Shanyun now. But the same is not the case with Shenhe and Ayaka. So it could be argued that it's better value if the character is a C6 4-star, even if they're only unlocked at C6. It could be argued that it's better value because if you could get, you know, C2 Ayaka alongside pulling for Shenhe, that could be pretty nice. But seems like we'll never really get to know, because they actually stopped doing, well, they did less. They stopped doing 5-star niche buffers because the next one was Faruzan Wanderer, and Faruzan buffs Animo, and so Wanderer and Zhao both want Faruzan, and that was a huge problem because they refused to rerun Faruzan on Zhao's banner, even though it would have made perfect sense. Fortunately, This has now been remedied with Faruzan running with Shan Yun as well, in addition to running on Wanderer's new rerun banner. So all is well in terms of Faruzan right now. I think Faruzan is the best of all the niche buffers. I think Gorou is the most usable at C0. Well, actually there's another one that's sort of considered, but Gorou is probably the most usable at C0. Faruzan is the best at C6. She just does the most, and it would have been better if her C6 was a little bit more spread out throughout her kit, because providing crowd control, energy, debuff, and crit damage bonus all it's for one constellation is just a bit heavy on one constellation. That basically functionally changes the entire character. But I think what really shows the power of Faruzan is how good she makes other characters. Like if you want to use her with DPS Lynette, for example, that is very, very doable. Or DPS Shan Yun. That is very, very doable. These characters can almost be considered Faruzan drivers because of how much buffing Faruzan gives them and makes them competent, very competent carries, which is very impressive. And she basically raises Zhao and Wander up an entire tier in terms of viability and power because of how strong she is. Unfortunately, the love didn't last with Mika, who is a dedicated physical buffer, but he just doesn't provide the power that physical needs. He doesn't provide the raw comfort and buffing that Faruzan does. He's more restrictive, both in terms of that he doesn't buff the whole team. He only buffs the on-field character. He doesn't provide the same type of... He provides a bit more value at C0, but some of his value is also in attack speed, which we've already talked about is not that good of a stat, especially for the physical units such as Fremine and Eula, where their Claymore weapon type makes them not be able to take advantage of this properly. So overall, Mika is just not as good of a character as Faruzan. I think he could be better if our physical carries would be better, and I think that this does show that Genshin wants to do more powerful physical carries in the future, which is why that Mika wasn't strong enough to just carry physical on his back. Because I think if they planned on making other physical carries weaker, like Eula, and having Mika compensate for them, they just would have made Mika a lot stronger. And Fremine, they would have made Fremine, well, Fremine is kind of weird too. But anyway, we're not talking about Fremine. We're talking about Mika. So the next one, in terms of dedicated buffers... Oh, wait. I just realized we have had another dedicated 5-star buffer. It's Shan Yun. Now, she is more... And then we'll talk about Chevreuse. But Shan Yun is more like Yunjin. Because she doesn't just buff Animo carries, she buffs all plunge carries, and she does it right. This is a character that buffs enough to actually be used over other options. She gives a big enough plunge damage to be used. Now, ironically, some people feel that she doesn't buff Zhao enough, but I think combined with the quality of life that she gives, not being tied to circle impact with Bennett, the greater healing, the comfort, and also the vertical investment potential, and also the fact that you can get Faruzan from her banners. All of this combined makes, I think, Zhao having a good upgrade from Shan Yun, although it's not as much pure raw power as it is a combination of, you know, single target performance and then not being tied to Bennett's circle, more comfort, etc. But for other characters, she just like invents a whole new archetype with Diluc Plunge, especially, and just other Claymore plunges. It's just very, very impressive how much buffing she gives and makes at a baseline team cores, the team core around her very, very, very good. So yeah, Shan Yun is a 5-star niche buffer done right, because she ends up not actually being niche. Because of how powerful her buff is, you can run anyone as a plunge carry and have it be competent and strong. And then finally, let's talk about Chevreuse, who is, I think, by far the best iteration of these niche buffers that we've had, because yes, she's kind of niche in that she only benefits overloaded teams. Oh, I guess we could talk about Nilou as well. She doesn't buff a character, she buffs a reaction, so that doesn't count. But Chevreuse makes you make new and different team comps that you never would have done before. And yes, you have to forego Kazuha for, you know, a lot of different characters like Raiden or Arlecchino. You have to forego Akazu, or you have to forego Farina or Yelan because you need to use Pyro and Electro together. But the trade-off is that she truly buffs a lot. And her buff isn't tied to her being on field to refresh the buff. She can refresh it fully from off field, which I think is a very, very underrated and valuable trade-off. People say that she's not good in AoE. I would agree for groupable AoE, but in terms of, but even still, yes, you're knocking enemies back, but if you're using a strong carry like Raiden or Arlecchino, you're just killing the mobs that you're throwing back so fast that it doesn't matter that you're throwing them back, you're just killing them. So to me, it's not too big of an issue. And yes, it is a bit of a trade-off that you can't run a grouper, but I think it's a worthy trade-off for what value she gives. In addition, she is actually a good character at C0. Like, yes, her C6 provides a whole next level of buffing, but it's like if Faruzan, if half of her C6 was just available at C0, she'd be a good character at C0 and then a broken character at C6, and I think that that's what Chevreuse is. And so that's two things that Chevreuse has fixed for me in terms of the niche buffing problem, is that number one, it makes team comps, like most niche buffers, make the team comps inherently more restrictive. Like Faruzan needing to be run with Wanderer, you know, it's just a character that is just a duo. You always need to run these two together. Whereas Chevreuse, she creates new teams that weren't ever seen before. So she enables creativity. And yes, you're restricted and you have to obviously run Pyro and Electro characters, but there's so many viable combinations, and any future Pyro and Electro character has the potential to work with her. Plus, some of her buffs actually do work without just needing a Pyro and Electro on the team. It's only her Resistance Shred that's tied to having Pyro and Electro characters, so you can forgo that Resistance Shred and run a Kazuha. You can do that if you want to. It's not usually worth it, but you can do that. You'll still get the C6 buff. As long as you're triggering an overloaded, you'll still get the attack buff, and you'll still, it's more viable of a strategy at C6, but it's not something that I really recommend, but it is something you can do. She is like a competent buffer, even outside of overloaded teams. Not great, but not bad. And with the overloaded teams, she really is great. So if this is sort of the trend I see with Genshin, and this is what I hope that they do, is when they introduce niche buffers like they have with Chevreuse and Shen Yun, that they don't restrict new characters to a smaller amount of team comps, but they give potential for brand new combinations and teams that have never been seen before. I would really like to see a Chevreuse that synergizes with Shenhe somehow and makes you run Hydro and Cryo characters together and really buffs Cryo reactions that way. And so Shenhe becomes a more valuable character. Maybe it's a character that actually has a reaction on bosses and increases, like you can actually freeze bosses, maybe not physically freeze them, but creates some sort of new reaction with Hydro and Cryo on bosses that can actually make it do boosted damage, so that Freeze have an option to use a freeze team, which doesn't freeze a big boss, but it has greatly increased damage because of this character. And then that increases Shenhe's viability, increases Ayaka's viability, increases Ganyu's viability, and Raizu's viability in Hydro Cryo teams in bosses, against bosses. I would like to see like a freeze Chevreuse kind of thing. And obviously there's so many reactions in the game, there's just unlimited potential for Genshin to do things like this. I think that they're going to do it sparingly because they can easily break the game by just it's essentially you're inventing new reactions almost. So I hope that they continue down this trend, or that they do what Shen Yun did and that they increase some random thing in the game so much that it's worth building a team around it all by itself. So I think that pretty much summarizes my thoughts on the problem with niche buffers. I think that there's a lot of problems that especially a lot of the older niche buffers have, but in the future I'm seeing the light. I'm seeing ways that they're trending towards better and better character design and team design and game design that can fix these niche buffer problems. Hopefully they just put Chevreuse on more banners so that you guys can actually enjoy this character, because this character is so freaking cool. I hope that, and they really need to fix the 4-star problem. I'll link my 4-star problem video at the end because that is a huge problem. I would have preferred that Chevreuse be a 5-star character, right? That's what like her whole kit is available at C0. Now let's do a little mini build guide for Faruzan and maybe some of the other niche buffers as well. I'm not going to cover pre-C6 builds for Faruzan. Well, I mean, I guess I will. You just build, if you're going to use her as an Animo buffer, pre-C6, it's just all about that ER. She needs so much ER. You want Fav, which fortunately you get for free. I would go with 2-piece Emblem, have an ER Sans, and just stack a bajillion ER. Once you hit C6, you don't need as much ER. I still like to use Fav, but I'm using 4-piece Tenacity with Energy Recharge. You ideally do want to build her for damage, but I just have random Tenacity pieces and it's totally fine. I have around 250 ER. You don't quite need that much, but I like the extra comfort. you definitely want to focus on her C6 or on her burst to level first, because that does increase your animal damage bonus. It's not the biggest part of the buffing in her kit, so it's not as you don't want to ignore it for sure. And you might as well invest into it. You might as well level 9 it or something like that, because I'm just saving resources. And I haven't descended her because I'm saving resources. Those gems are freaking hard to get. So depending on how many characters you build, it might be worth it to ascend and level 9 or crown her burst, and it might not. Does she make non-C6 Hazo viable? No. Non-C6 Hazo is still not that good. He's a little bit better if you use him in a plunge team with Faruzan and Shen Yun, but it's still not that good. The main reason why is because it's not, his multipliers aren't, like his plunge multipliers aren't better than Shen Yun's plunge multipliers, and so you're better off taking him out of the team, using Shen Yun as the plunger, and then using another buffer, because then you get more buffers on your team. I think that's why Shen Yun is a decent DPS with Faruzan, because she fills the role of buffer and DPS. So you can run all three of Faruzan, Farina, and Bennett, and plus she's buffing herself. So if you like Shen Yun and you want to try this, I highly recommend it. If you want more info on it, I did cover it in my Shen Yun guide. For other niche buffers, I didn't get a chance to make a Gorou guide, but he also generally wants Favonius, although if you can't build the crit rate, Sacrificial is a solid option. I have him on 4-piece Exile with an energy recharge Sands. You can either do a 4-star energy recharge Sands and then find an off-piece that has a lot of energy recharge. Like for example, I have this off-piece that has 23% energy recharge. This can sometimes yield better results than running a 5-star energy recharge Sands, because if you think about the math, it's 51% energy recharge. I actually accidentally foddered my energy recharge Sands, Exile Sands. Pretty upset. I foddered my entire Exile set, unfortunately, so I'm using unleveled pieces right now. But Exile is great because it's a 4-star set that you just get passively. It regenerates elemental energy for the whole party when he uses his burst, so that's really, really cool. But this isn't the only option that Gorou has. You can also use a defense build, which technically increases his buffing potential by very little, but it also increases his healing. And so you can actually build him as a healer if you have C4 by giving him tons of defense. And you can either use Husk and giving him tons of defense, or you can use like Maiden's Beloved and on defense stuff, which is hilarious. So that's something you can do, and then actually run him on a Farina team with Ito, and he can be your healer. I personally find that it's not very practical. So, but if you're like a god gamer, that could be something worth trying. You definitely don't want to get hit if you're running that team, because taking extra, he doesn't heal very much. So taking extra damage is really rough. I wish, rough the dog. I wish that he used like Prototype Amber. Like if there was a bow that heals your team or something like that, if he used Prototype Amber, that would be really. Let me know your thoughts on the niche buffer situation. Make sure to check out the 4-star problem here. Take care. Bye for now.